Now, I'm hoping that you've already stopped using tables for layout. If you haven't, stop now. There are really no excuses left for using a HTML table for layout. If you're like me and you've been working with CSS-based layouts for a period of time, you've probably pretty much forgotten how to make web page layouts using tables. Still, it can sometimes be fun to remember how we used to work, and just for the hell of it, I decided to try my hand at using a layout table for this version of the Activate the Death Ray homepage. Although you won't see much of a difference between this and the CSS layout on the surface, under the surface, things are looking pretty ugly. Now that CSS is more widely used for web page layout, the table element can be put back to its intended use for displaying tabular data, such as a table containing Flash Gordon comic strips and when they were originally published. From now on, we'll refer to these as data tables. Both WCAG 1 and WCAG 2 address data tables and how they should be marked up specifically. In WCAG 1, for data tables, identify row and column headings. In WCAG 2, information, structure and relationships conveyed through presentation can be programmatically determined or are available as text. Specifically, use table markup to present tabular information and use the scope to associate header cells and data cells. Layout tables were largely unstructured, with few or no relationships between the content of their rows and cells. In contrast, a data table must contain explicit relationships between cells and their associated headings. Let's consider this first example where visually the content appears structured, but this appearance is deceiving as this unstructured table contains only table cells. If you're listening to this table being read to you from top to bottom and from left to right, there is nothing to indicate to you the structure of the content. This data table is simple, and adding structure and meaning to its content while at the same time making it more accessible is simple too. The TH table header element immediately distinguishes those cells as header cells. But which cells and in which reading direction do these header cells relate to? To define the reading direction as a row, you should add a scope attribute with a value of row to each table header. In this example, the headers are column headers, as their associated cells form a column, so you should add col as your scope attribute value. Look closely, and you should also notice that this table has two reading directions, first as columns under title, year, publisher and the ISBN number, but also horizontally in rows across from the title of each comic strip, for example, Mongo, Planet of Doom. Your next job should be to replace the unspecific TD with a meaningful TH table header and apply scope attributes with values of row. With your simple data table marked up in this way, you've made it practically more accessible, but you've also satisfied the WCAG 2 success criteria that asks you to create information, structure and relationships that can be programmatically determined. Now let's move on to a more complicated example. It's perhaps the most complicated table that I've ever marked up. I have to be honest, in 10 years of working on the web, I've never been asked to create a table of this kind. A table with complicated relationships between cells and several table headers at the same time. We'll refer to this type of table as a layered data table. Instead of using two separate tables, this layered data table explains how many heroic and dastardly deeds were done every year in the Flash Gordon stories. There is information in the left for cartoon strips and on the right for movie serials. Actually, I made this information up. You should start in the normal way by adding header cells where you see cartoon strips and movie serials. Now, give each of these header cells a unique identity. I chose to use the row number and cell numbers as my IDs, prefixed with a letter because an ID can't begin with a number. Next, move on to the second row of headers, scores, heroic and dastardly, giving them each their own identity. Finally, give each of the score years their own identity. Here I've chosen to use R3, R4, R5 and so on. With your header identities in place, your layered data cells can refer precisely to their associated headers. For example, the number 51 in the second column of the fifth row relates to header R5, which contains 1938, as these heroic deeds occurred that year. But by associating that number with other header identities, those relationships are precisely defined. There were 51 heroic deeds in 1938, and those deeds were shown in cartoon strips. The same principles apply to every cell in this table, explicitly defining the precise relationships between the data and headings. This type of precise information, presented this way, doesn't come without a cost though, as manually marking up layered data can be very time consuming. In this next example, the thankfully simpler table has a title or heading above it, telling us what the table contains. Flash Gordon comic strip reprints. You might choose to mark up that title using a standard heading element, H1 through H6, but if you decide to caption your table using the caption element, you'll programmatically link that table to its associated title. How can you provide more information about a table's contents so that a blind person can choose whether to navigate it or not? By providing a summary overview of that content to a person using a screen reader. I specifically highlighted people who use screen readers because the summary attribute doesn't appear visually in a web browser. So what about sighted people? Could this hidden information be useful and interesting to them too? Of course it could be. That's why it's perfectly acceptable and perfectly accessible for you to provide an overview of your tables using any appropriate markup. In the final table example, I've added a simple descriptive paragraph before the table so that the overview will be available to everyone. In this section, you learnt that you must always specify header cells, and where it's appropriate, you should also identify these header cells to make your structured data cells more accessible. You learnt to specify a data table's reading direction using the scope attribute with values of col or row. You can programmatically link data cells to their associated headings using the caption element, and that you can provide a useful overview of a table's content using either the summary attribute or other meaningful markup.